Greetings to all of you at PCC LA Learning Center with this Old Testament survey. So we're now halfway through the Old Testament survey and reaching lessons 7A, 7B, and 7C. What we're doing this week is I am going to summarize lessons 7A and 7B, and then we will use the full recording from R.C. Sproul as the main lecture time for 7C. The reason for this is to try to cover more ground in areas where we feel that we can keep this on a survey basis and not deal with things that are more detailed, which hopefully you'll see as we move through this time together, as well as next the lesson 7B, which will follow. So we now begin lesson 7A. This is a lesson on the particular name and what is meant and how the tabernacle was used by God and by the Israelites. And this story really begins at the beginning of the Exodus. So they have been freed from Pharaoh. They are now beginning to march towards the Promised Land. And as we will see, unbeknownst to them, they don't realize that it's going to be a 40-year long march to the Promised Land. So on each of these slides that are coming, you'll see a letter at the top of it, and that refers and ties directly to the lecture notes, which are provided in the PDF file for this lesson. So we begin section A with a reference from the New Testament, actually, John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, where it reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt," or could be translated, or tabernacled among us. So in this last section, we see in a real sense the meaning of the particular word in light of the person of Christ coming to the world. This could be translated, "and the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us," as we will see that the tabernacle actually was a tent-like object which was placed in the camp of the Israelites as they moved through the desert on their exodus. Or it could also be read as "the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us." So in this, hopefully, we see the key part of this is to understand that the root word that's used here is that tabernacle was known to be a place of worship. And in the Old Testament times, and particularly with the Israelites at this time in their life, that image is to be viewed clearly as it relates to what will happen as it relates to us worshiping the person of Jesus in that way. So part B explains that the three most important parts of Exodus are the first part for roughly 5 chapters of the Exodus and the remembrance of the Passover. The second from Exodus 18 for about 6 chapters through, which deals with the particular giving of the law and the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. And the third part, chapter 25 through chapter 40, 15 chapters of Exodus, is dealing with the details of the construction of the tabernacle. As you will see, we will not spend very much time in that particular area. So sections C and D now deal with the issue of how exactly did God and his people experience worship during the patriarchal period prior to the Exodus and the people leaving the bounds of Pharaoh. So during the patriarchal period, we see the example of a couple illustrations. One is there were at times open sacrifices in fields where they were at the particular time of the encounter with God, and those involved the shedding of blood of animals. Second, what we see particularly after the flood, is the beginning of Noah building a altar out of stones in the middle of the field, but obviously, as you can imagine, setting a place of more permanence to a particular location. And what this does is this begins to give us a sense of God choosing to remember and have his people remember specific events both in time and in space. You could begin to see this a bit in the sense of the way we view unique holidays in the Christian calendar of Easter and of Christmas. And while we don't have a particular altar that we come to, we do stop at those particular times. And much like the Passover meal was to be a remembrance to those who followed of what happened during the Passover, we use the celebration of Easter and Christmas as unique times to celebrate what Jesus has done, both in the coming into the world at Christmas and then the dying on the cross and paying for our sins at Calvary. So the first example we see in the Old Testament deals with Noah, and then the second is that after Abraham receives the covenant of grace in Genesis 15, which I talked about earlier during our study on Abraham, he also built a specific altar that was used for future worship times. So there were specific grounds, specific locations, which were then considered sacred as to the unique occurrences which had taken place there. So section E now deals with the why question of the tabernacle and the understanding that there was to be this unique place of worship. It was to be, if you will, a mobile altar, and it was also sometimes called the tent of meeting because it was actually a tent, and inside of that tent, as we will see, was the place where the worship would be conducted, and also it included what we will come to see here in a minute, a unique Ark of the Covenant will be there. So it was also easily collapsible and transportable. So if you will, think about like we have a number of 10 by 10 tents that are pop-up tents that we use for various functions at PCC. And obviously this tent of meeting was much larger and had much more detail to it, but it would be a similar kind of thing as that in the sense that it would be collapsible, transportable, and then when the Israelites reached their next location where they were going to camp, they would then set it up again for their times of worship. So the Exodus was beginning, and as I've said before, it was unknown to the people because of a number of issues that would come up, that this Exodus would actually take place over a 40-year period of time. So this even accentuates that much more the reason for this place of worship and, in a sense, the place of remembrance needed to be mobile for their purpose. As we saw both when we see the giving of the commandments and even to a degree in the early days of the Exodus, when the people of God were very forgetful of what God had done for them. There are stories of when they complained about their life in the desert and wanting to go back under the slavery oppression of the Pharaoh. We also see that while Moses was on Mount Sinai, receiving from God the Ten Commandments, that they defaulted and begged Aaron to create an image, a false image, that they would worship in the sense of believing that God had abandoned them or they had to create their own to take care of things accordingly. So obviously a very dysfunctional group of people, much like we are still today. And the purpose again of the tabernacle was to have a place of remembrance, to bring their minds and their hearts back to the place of thankfulness and rejoicing for what God had done in their lives. So section F now begins the study on the placement of the tabernacle within the campsite. This is a relatively small detail, but it's important from a standpoint of, again, this remembrance and the imagery that would have been true at the time for this group of new nomads who are now moving through the desert in a particular and directional way. So it was always set up in the middle of the camp, and the tribes of Israel would then encircle the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle. And this was to bring about, obviously, the clear symbolism of God being in the middle or the midst of his people. Once again, it kind of reckons back to that passage in John 1 that we started our study with, that God came and dwelt among us, was in the midst of us, and it is very, again, foretelling of what is to come as it relates to our relationship with God. So it's very common in this period of time, as there were many nomads and groups of nomads who would travel the various lands, they would have either some form of a leader, or sometimes even called a king, as we see later in Scripture, where people, that once they're settled in the Promised Land, they look around and they say, well, other people have kings. And those would have been nomadic people that would have possessed and occupied certain areas of land, which we see in the various battles that come up in future days. And so the tent of the king, or the leader, was always placed in the middle of camp, one, for the protection of the king or the leader from some attacks from outside of the people that he was leading, as well as, again, the imagery of the centrality of the leadership there. So again, this tabernacle was to be viewed as God being their king, and again, that would foretell of the way that Jesus is king of our lives, all the way now in the New Testament and in Los Angeles in 2018, but also, as we will see, after this period of the patriarch leaders, and then there will be a period of judges, and then eventually we will see a period of kings for the nation of Israel. And so again, all this is kind of sequencing towards that particular truth. So lastly, here we have the remainder of what is on R.C. Sproul's lecture. In section G through I, there are specifics about the dimensions of the tabernacle. You will see in there, if you want to, very precise issues that God directed the people to do. In J through K, it talks very much about unique instruments that were to be used by the priest during the worship service, and all of those instruments have a particular image and a representation of the work and the person of Jesus, as we look back from now at those particular instruments. Letter L deals with the details of the unique particular Ark of the Covenant, in which was stored manna, and also the actual tablets that the people will be given for the Ten Commandments. What's important to understand in section F, as it summarizes, is that the whole work of redemption and mercy and judgment, those three main themes of the Bible, redemption, mercy, and judgment, are all found in living symbols of the tabernacle when it was first given to the people, and as we see it now in modern age. For any of those of you who have the extra time and would like to hear the entire of R.C. Sproul's lecture for this lesson 7a, it is available, and we're showing it as bonus material at the bottom of this particular area. But this ends up being a little less than a 15-minute time frame together, as opposed to 25 minutes.